Nobody in CBS Studio 52 that night realized they were about to witness a moment that would echo far beyond television ratings, contracts, and rehearsed smiles. Because in less than 30 minutes, a young Bob Dylan would be told to change his song or leave, and his one-word response would fracture the illusion of control that network television believed it owned. The hallway smelled of hot cables, stale coffee, and nervous sweat, the kind of invisible tension that only appears when something valuable is at stake, and technicians moved with exaggerated quiet, pretending not to notice the raised voices behind the frosted glass doors of the executive office, where a confrontation was unfolding that no one had planned for and no one knew how to stop. Dylan stood near the stage with his guitar resting against his thigh, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert, as if he were listening not to the room, but to something deeper, something internal that no executive memo could touch, while producers whispered in clusters, glancing at their watches and calculating the cost of chaos in seconds and sponsor dollars, because live television had no patience for rebellion. Earlier that afternoon, everything had seemed simple. Dylan would perform a safe, familiar song, something poetic but harmless, something that wouldn't upset advertisers or provoke angry phone calls from conservative groups, something that would fit neatly into the polished Sunday night fantasy CBS had perfected over decades. But during rehearsal, Dylan had done something unexpected, something dangerous, something impossible to undo. He had sung a different song, sharper, funnier, more biting, filled with uncomfortable truths wrapped in humor that made the lawyers stiffen and the producers exchange looks that said this is going to be a problem. By the time the final rehearsal ended, word had already reached the upper floors of the building, where executives in tailored suits reviewed lyrics the way generals study enemy maps, and within minutes, a decision had been made that would change everything. The song was unacceptable. Harold Green, a senior CBS executive whose reputation had been built on keeping artists in line and sponsors happy, walked briskly down the corridor toward the stage, his footsteps measured and confident, his expression calm in the way only someone accustomed to power could manage, while Dylan's manager hovered nearby, sensing disaster but unable to name it, knowing only that this was not the kind of conversation any young artist wanted to have minutes before a national broadcast. Green stopped a few feet from Dylan, adjusted his cufflinks, and spoke quietly enough that only those closest could hear, yet loud enough that the weight of his words pressed against the room like gravity, telling Dylan that CBS could not allow the song to be performed, that the lyrics were too political, too provocative, too unpredictable, that families across America tuned in for comfort, not confrontation, that sponsors did not pay millions to be blindsided by satire, and that if Dylan wanted to stay on the show, he would need to choose a different song immediately. Dylan listened without interrupting, his fingers lightly touching the guitar strings as if testing whether the instrument could still speak when words failed, while his manager stepped forward with a strained smile and suggested compromise, reminding him of the opportunity, the exposure, the doors that could open with a single performance, the years of struggle that had led to this moment, and the fragility of success in an industry that rewarded obedience more than honesty. Green's voice grew firmer, his patience thinning as the countdown clock on the wall ticked closer to airtime, emphasizing that this was not a debate but a directive, that CBS had built its empire on predictable entertainment, that no single artist, especially not a young folk singer with a rebellious streak, was worth jeopardizing that stability, and that Dylan had exactly two options: change the song or leave the building. The words hung in the air longer than they should have, and in that suspended moment, the studio felt strangely small, as if decades of television history had narrowed into a single hallway and a single decision, while crew members held their breath and avoided eye contact, afraid that acknowledging the confrontation might make it real, because everyone understood the unspoken rule of show business. You don't challenge the gatekeepers. You negotiate, you adapt, you survive. Dylan's manager whispered urgently that they could fight later, that this was not the hill to die on, that one song tonight did not erase the chance to say something bigger tomorrow. But Dylan's expression did not change, and when he finally looked at Green, there was no anger in his eyes, only clarity, the kind that comes when a person realizes that compromise, once made, never truly ends. Green misread the silence as hesitation and leaned closer, explaining the consequences in practical terms. Lost opportunities, damaged relationships, invisible blacklists that could quietly suffocate a career. While Dylan's mind wandered back to coffee houses and cramped apartments, to nights when music had been the only thing that felt real, when no one had told him what he could or couldn't say, and as the seconds slipped away, he understood something with unsettling certainty. If he changed the song tonight, he would never stop changing it. Around them, the machinery of television hummed impatiently, cameras warming up, scripts being shuffled, stage managers preparing backup plans, while Green waited for compliance with the confidence of a man who had never been refused, because in his world, artists eventually bent, and Dylan's manager finally looked at him with quiet desperation, as if begging him to choose survival over pride. But Dylan adjusted the strap of his guitar instead, shifted his weight, and took a slow breath, the kind of breath people take not before surrendering, but before stepping into something irreversible. And in that moment, with millions of unseen viewers and decades of institutional authority pressing down on him, Bob Dylan made a decision that no one in the room was prepared for, a decision that would soon explode far beyond the walls of CBS, not as a performance, not as a song, but as a statement. And the first crack in the illusion of control had already begun to form, even before he spoke a single word. By the time the studio clock showed 15 minutes to airtime, the confrontation had stopped being a private disagreement and had become a silent emergency that everyone in CBS Studio 52 could feel, but no one could openly name, because Bob Dylan had not answered yet. And in the world of live television, uncertainty was more dangerous than rebellion. Harold Green stood with his arms crossed, his authority radiating from the tailored lines of his suit, convinced that silence was only a tactic, that every young artist eventually calculated risk and chose survival. While Dylan remained motionless on the edge of the stage, his guitar balanced against his hip like an extension of his body, his eyes scanning the studio not with fear, but with a strange detachment, as if he were already imagining the moment from the outside, the way history might one day tell it. His manager whispered again, this time more urgently, reminding him of contracts, record deals, radio stations, and the fragile network of favors that made careers possible, explaining that CBS was not just a television show but a gate, and gates did not forgive those who tried to break them, while a young production assistant hovered nearby, pretending to adjust cables, secretly watching Dylan with the kind of fascination reserved for people who might either ruin everything or change it forever. Green finally stepped forward again, his voice losing its earlier calm, telling Dylan that the show could not wait for artistic introspection, that the audience did not tune in for philosophical battles, that music on television was supposed to comfort, not confront, and that CBS had no intention of letting a 20-something folk singer turn a Sunday night broadcast into a political statement. While Dylan's manager nodded reluctantly beside him, already envisioning headlines about a difficult artist who had wasted his chance, because in their world, reputation was currency and defiance was debt. But Dylan did not argue, did not apologize, did not negotiate, and the longer he stayed silent, the more it unsettled the people around him, because silence from someone with nothing to lose was more frightening than anger from someone who wanted to win. 10 minutes to airtime, and producers began moving performers in the lineup, quietly preparing for the possibility that Dylan would not appear, while stage managers whispered into headsets and backup acts rehearsed hastily rewritten introductions. And in the control room, executives stared at monitors like gamblers watching a wheel that refused to stop spinning. Green checked his watch, then looked directly at Dylan and said, with less diplomacy and more command, that CBS had already made its decision, that there would be no debate on air, no surprises, no protests, and that Dylan needed to understand the reality of the situation. If he walked out, there would be consequences, not just tonight, but for years to come, consequences that no amount of talent could undo. Dylan finally shifted, lifting his guitar slightly as if testing its weight, and for a brief moment, his manager thought he was about to agree, thought he saw resignation in the tightening of his jaw, but what he actually saw was resolve, the kind that comes not from anger but from clarity, because Dylan had begun to realize that the choice in front of him was not about one song, one show, or one executive, but about who he would become if he allowed someone else to decide what he was allowed to say. Around them, The studio continued its frantic choreography, the machinery of television moving forward regardless of individual conflict, because the show would go on with or without him. And that realization, instead of frightening Dylan, seemed to calm him, because it stripped the moment of illusion and revealed its true nature. CBS did not need him, but he did not need CBS either. 5 minutes to airtime, and Green made his final attempt, stepping closer and lowering his voice, telling Dylan that he was young, that youth had a way of confusing stubbornness with courage, that history was full of artists who had destroyed themselves by refusing to compromise, and that the smart ones learned to fight battles strategically rather than emotionally, while Dylan listened with an expression that was almost gentle, as if he understood Green perfectly and simply disagreed with the premise of his world. In the control room, a producer counted down remaining time and clipped phrases, while a lighting technician whispered to another that Dylan might actually walk, and the idea sounded absurd even as it felt inevitable, because no one walked away from CBS, not when millions of viewers and a lifetime of opportunity waited just beyond the curtain. 2 minutes to airtime, and the audience began clapping in anticipation, unaware that the show they had come to see was already unraveling backstage, while Green straightened his jacket one last time and asked Dylan, with a tone that was no longer threatening but almost pleading, whether he truly understood what he was about to do. Dylan looked past him, toward the stage lights, toward the empty microphone that waited for him like an invitation and a trap at the same time, and for a brief second, the entire studio seemed to pause, as if even the cameras sensed that something irreversible was about to happen, because Dylan had reached the point where compromise felt more dangerous than rebellion, and whatever he was going to say next would not just decide the night's broadcast, but redraw the invisible line between power and freedom that everyone in the room had always assumed would never be crossed. 30 seconds before the red broadcast light was scheduled to ignite, CBS Studio 52 existed in a strange state between order and collapse, where every person sensed that history was about to tilt, but no one knew in which direction. And Harold Green stood directly in front of Bob Dylan with the confidence of a man who had never lost a battle and the unease of a man who suspected he might be about to. While Dylan stood still with his guitar resting against his chest, his expression calm in a way that felt almost dangerous, because calm in moments like this did not come from obedience but from decision. And when Green asked him one final time whether he was going to change the song, the room leaned inward as if the walls themselves were listening, expecting negotiation, apology, calculation, or at least hesitation. But Dylan gave none of it, and instead he looked at Green with a quiet steadiness that felt older than his years, and said just one word, no, a word so small it seemed incapable of carrying the weight of what it had just destroyed and created at the same time, because in that instant, the hierarchy of television cracked, and Green stared at him as if he had misunderstood the language, while producers froze mid-motion, stagehands stopped adjusting lights, and Dylan's manager felt the kind of dread usually reserved for disasters that cannot be reversed, and before anyone could respond, Dylan shifted his guitar strap, turned toward the exit, and began walking. Not fast, not dramatic, but with the unhurried certainty of someone who had already accepted the consequences, and behind him chaos erupted in whispers and shouted orders. Backup performers were rushed into position, scripts were rewritten with shaking hands, and Green barked commands into headsets that suddenly felt useless, because no amount of executive authority could rewind what had just happened, while Dylan pushed through the stage door and stepped into the cold night air, where the city continued moving without noticing that a small revolution had just taken place inside a television studio. And as he walked down the street with his guitar knocking lightly against his hip, the fear he had expected never arrived, replaced instead by a strange lightness, as if he had finally shed a version of himself that did not belong to him. While inside CBS the show went on as planned, but felt fundamentally different, because the absence of one young musician had revealed how fragile control really was. Within hours, rumors began to spread through New York's music circles, whispered in coffee houses, passed between journalists, amplified by young musicians who sensed instinctively that something important had happened, and by the next morning newspapers began printing headlines about a folk singer who had refused to change his song. while CBS issued carefully worded statements about contractual misunderstandings and scheduling changes that fooled no one who understood the subtext of power, and what executives had assumed would be a footnote instead became a story, and what they had tried to suppress became a symbol, because people were not interested in the song Dylan had refused to change as much as the fact that he had refused at all. In the weeks that followed, record stores reported increased demand for his albums. College students memorized his lyrics like secret codes. Journalists debated whether he was reckless or courageous, and young artists watched closely, realizing for the first time that saying no was not always the end of a career, but sometimes the beginning of one. While CBS executives privately admitted that the incident had exposed something they had never considered, that control was not absolute, that culture could move faster than networks, and that sometimes the most powerful performance was the one that never reached the stage. Years later, when Dylan was asked about the night he walked away from CBS, he did not speak about executives, sponsors, or television politics, but simply said that he had been asked to become someone he wasn't, and he had decided that fame was not worth that price. And in that quiet explanation lay the true meaning of the moment, because the legend of Bob Dylan was not built only on songs and albums, but on moments when he refused to bend, moments when he chose authenticity over approval. And the irony was that by walking away from millions of viewers, he had finally become impossible to ignore. Somewhere in a CBS archive, recordings of that night still exist, lists of revised lineups, frantic memos, and forgotten footage of a stage that waited for a singer who never appeared. But the real story is not preserved on tape, because it happened in the space between a command and a refusal, between power and conscience, when a young musician decided that his voice mattered more than the platform that tried to contain it, and long after the studio lights dimmed and the executives moved on to new controversies, the echo of that one-word answer continued to ripple through music and culture, reminding anyone who dared to listen that sometimes the bravest act is not performing on the biggest stage, but walking away from it when the cost of staying is losing your truth.